Lisa, it was a few months ago now, I went to a conference and it was the Brighton Summit. And it's a big deal in Brighton because we don't have that many conferences that happen every year. And this one's a really good one. It's run by the Chamber of Commerce and it is fantastic. And it's held in a great place. And they have these workshops that happen throughout the day. And I decided to go onto a workshop about communication because I deal with communication quite a lot and I help people with their communication, and it was really interesting. The guys that ran this workshop, they were fab. However, when it came to asking people about what is good communication and what is bad communication, quite an outdated kind of view came forward, and one that was quite prominent was eye contact is paramount in good communication. We have to make sure that we have excellent eye contact to be a good communicator. And my friend who I was with, quite rightly, kicked up about that. She was very vocal about that. And so they did caveat that in saying, we do realise that some people, perhaps some people who are neurodivergent, may have difficulty in communicating that way. And so we need to kind of update the way we're thinking about how we're communicating with people, particularly in the corporate world, particularly in the workplace. In that, yes, we can be influential, and yes, we can really apply listening and all of these great tactics and strategies that work for the majority of people. But there also needs to be an understanding of the nuances of neurodiversity and what we need to understand in order to really communicate effectively with people who have neurodiversity, and how we can enhance the impact of our communication. So what are your thoughts on that and your experience of the kind of outdated views?
Yeah, thank you. I think you're absolutely right. It is really outdated. But just the way you described it there is the way it's still perceived. So whilst people say, oh, we recognise that some people may struggle to communicate that way, that's still implying that those of us who do struggle that way are still in the wrong. And somehow we're just not trying hard enough. But if you think about communication in general, think about the ways we consume information these days. So little of it is actually face-to-face. We work online, in businesses, people are working on chat, they're working on Teams, they're working on emails, working over Zoom, where it's even harder to be having that real eye contact, because just in the way that we're online at the minute, I'm looking at you, but I'm not looking at my camera. So it looks like I'm not making eye contact with you. So that's a really valid example of so little of our communication these days is physically being in the same room. So if we're judging everyone on whether they're making eye contact, I mean, it's almost impossible on a computer to be looking at you and looking at my camera and, and making eye contact. But people don't think about those things. I just think there are so many ways of communicating and thinking about social media. We're not looking at whether someone is looking directly at the camera when we're looking at social media. Most of the time, we're looking at the subtitles, we're looking at all the other things going on the page. We just don't focus on that. So where we have this perception that communication is all about eye contact, I just think there's so much more to it these days. And we don't say that all of those people are communicating poorly. Some of the most engaging people are not sat in the middle of their screen looking at you, and you still think they are brilliant communicators. They're getting their message across. So there are so many ways to communicate that don't rely on eye contact. And I think we should just expand what our expectation is and not talk about it being, this is what you should be doing, but also neurodivergent people might struggle with it, and saying communication is vast. What are all the ways we can communicate that are actually good communication?
So I totally get that. And how you're saying it just makes so much sense in that gosh, it is we just do not hardly speak face to face anymore. So it's almost kind of null and void, that whole eye contact thing. And for everybody, we're not sort of singling out a group of people here. For everybody, that applies. And it makes me think then, for everybody, how has that evolved in terms of what are we valuing? And I know we're going to come on to the specifics here in a minute, but what are we valuing as good communication in this digital world where we are on Zoom and we're not looking at the camera? What are we valuing as good communication now, as opposed to when we were all in offices all the time, speaking directly to each other? We were out in the real world all the time, speaking directly to each other. What are we valuing now?
For me, the things that I value in communication is simply having the sense that someone is paying attention and engaging with me when speaking. So if that's in the room one-to-one, that's easier to gauge. But with online communication, which is where I spend most of my days, it's about people being physically present in an online sense. And by that, I mean not feeling like someone is watching the chat when you're in a group meeting. And sometimes at the start, people will say, if you're on a webinar, oh, do engage in the chat, say hello to people, say where you're from. And I think, please don't, because it completely distracts you from the conversation that's going on. So I think the chat is there for a reason. And it can be used really valuably. But for me, it's that sense that even if you're in a group meeting, feeling that people are still engaging and paying attention to the people who are on the call, not to all the other things going on around. And with online communication, it's even more distracting because we've still got our emails popping up unless we've turned the notifications off. We've still got all of the other communication channels. There's still the opportunity to be online on Google looking up other things. And I know it can be really, really distracting. So it's about people just engaging and being as present as you can.
That's exactly it. It's in the age of intelligence and the age of technology, being heard and focused upon, being paid attention to without distraction has so much value for anyone. So we want to be heard and understood and seen as well. And therefore, if someone is demonstrating in their communication that they do see us, they do hear us, they do understand us, without looking at their phone, engaging in the chat, doing work whilst having the meeting. When people having the meetings and someone's looking off, they're on mute and they're looking off elsewhere whilst the meeting's going on, all of that. It's off-putting and you don't feel seen, heard, understood. And that applies across the board. However, we are talking about a particular type of communication here, and we're going to really dive into this because in my world, I straddle two worlds. I straddle the entrepreneurial online world where there's solopreneurs, I hate that term, small business owners, coaches, consultants, freelancers, who are a lot of people I know are neurodivergent because their brains and their minds have lent themselves to forging forward and creating and thinking outside the box and starting up their own businesses. And so I have that audience. And then I also have the corporate audience because my background is in leadership development and talent, where I'm working with senior leaders who are bringing a large number of people with them. And in each of these situations, communication is absolutely essential. And we do have a growing awareness of neurodiversity. We understand that lots of people have different traits and different ways of thinking and feeling and being and doing. We're not just one size fits all humans. One type of communication doesn't work. We know all this, and it's becoming more okay to talk about it, and it's becoming more okay to understand it. However, it still needs to be spoken about more, and I think what we really need to understand is the benefits of focusing on this within the people strategy, for example, within an organization. And I know that, that's something that you help people with. And so I guess it's just about, from your perspective, what are the benefits of really putting this on the agenda rather than just saying, okay, this is how we communicate with everyone?
Mm-hmm. You say the growing awareness of neurodiversity in the workplace, and I would agree that there is a growing awareness of it. I wouldn't yet go so far as to say there's a proper understanding of it. And the more information there is, the more people almost think they've become an expert overnight because they've seen something online, or they've got a couple of members of staff who've disclosed that they're neurodivergent. And by speaking with those people, you then have companies starting to say, oh, we've got a neurodivergent person, we've got one person who's autistic. And then they base the whole strategy around what that person needs. And similarly, the harmful language, to my mind, of when you say, oh, people got superpowers, so you're
Right.
autistic, you must be fantastic at data, that's your superpower. And that's just a really, really harmful narrative.
Can I just dig into that a little bit?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because, so my son's currently going through assessment. He's been going through assessment for quite some time now. And without going into too much detail, he does become very kind of, down and frustrated because of the lack of understanding. And so for a time, I did use that term to try and help him to focus on his strengths in terms of how amazing some of these, these traits really are.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that can be a potentially harmful narrative.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a difference between using the language with children, and exactly as you say, so my son is also neurodivergent, he's ADHD, autistic and dyspraxic. And so when a child is struggling to come to terms with that, then yes, giving them some positive language can be really helpful. But as adults in the workplace, when it's used as a judgment, it's not generally used to help someone feel better about their neurodivergence. It's more used as a perception of, oh, you're ADHD, so your superpower is hyperfocus, and you're autistic, so your superpower is data. And in some cases, that will be a strength of neurodivergence. So I know from my own psychologist reports that my data and analytical processing is on the 99.9th percentile. So I am very strong in data and analytics, but I would never say it's a superpower, because that makes it feel like I'm trying to be better than everyone else, not just to be good at things, but to say, oh, I'm some kind of superhero now, I'm going to save the company with my awesome abilities.
Right.
And by using that term, we take away from the fact that neurodivergence is a disability. So yes, we do have strengths, and again, not everyone has strengths. So some people who are neurodivergent will only have challenges. It depends on each person's individual profile. But for most of us, we will have strengths and we'll have challenges. And in terms of the people strategy, by supporting the challenges, we enable people to access their strengths. We don't turn them all into superheroes overnight. We just enable people to bring their whole self to work, being supported where they need, and therefore being enabled to access the strengths. Whereas if you don't support the challenges, you don't get the strengths either, because the person is expending so much energy trying to manage those challenges themselves, trying to exist in a workplace that they're not comfortable in, that there's no energy left to bring those positives.
Oh, that's quite a profound revelation here, because
Thank you.
I'm thinking about the human condition, right? Particularly maybe culturally, the UK, in that what's happened culturally is we've heard whispers on the wind of how to communicate with people with neurodiversities, in that we want to be really positive, and we want to, focus on strengths, and this real, let's focus on the good rather than the bad. And in that sort of whispering on the wind, that's then resulted, it sounds quite patronizing. It's quite a patronizing thing to say, and also very assumptive in labeling in that way. Oh, you have autism, that must mean you're really good at data, that must mean you're hyper intelligent, and so therefore you can be put on this pedestal or be seen as a superhero to solve the organization's problems. I can see where that's come from, maybe from a good intentional place, whereas the reality is quite different. And then conversely, to what we do instead, which is so important. And again, I'm thinking back to my son and him being at school, which he's really struggling with, is we've got to focus on the challenges and providing space, meeting needs, and understanding, so therefore strengths can be accessed. There's energy to apply strength, because you're then operating off a baseline rather than feeling in a deficit in terms of a need not being met.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as you speak about your son, I've spoken about mine, I think a really good example that you can translate into the workplace. My son attends a specialist school, so his needs could not be met in a mainstream environment. And when he was in a mainstream environment, albeit he was in an independent school, so quite small school, he would be having meltdowns every day. I was having more than daily interactions with the school about his behaviour, about him not participating in lessons, leaving lessons. But actually, he was being bullied mercilessly, and he just could not cope in that environment. So he wasn't able to learn, which as a parent is so hard to go through. But once we were able to get him into a specialist environment where it's 100 boys and they're all neurodivergent, the whole setup plays to those challenges. So all of the things that are challenges are recognised, and they create an environment that minimises those challenges. And when he first went there, I thought, wow, these teachers, i.e. these leaders, that's what they really are. They are the leaders of the children. I thought, wow, these must be some amazing teachers. They must work so hard. They must have these awesome skills to enable these boys not to have all these meltdowns, or to manage all of these meltdowns. Imagine if you put all of the boys in one place, it must be mayhem, all this meltdown. And actually anything but, because the environment supports them, they don't have the meltdowns. They are all able to learn, and because they all come from that similar mindset, they all rub along and they communicate well with each other. They don't have any problems communicating. They form friendship groups. They participate in the lessons, and it's awesome. And it took a lot of understanding to think, yeah, when you make the environment work for people, you don't have those challenges, and therefore they're able to bring their strengths. And I'm not suggesting that we should be creating workplaces purely for neurodivergent people, but saying that finding those ways to support the challenges makes all the difference.
Well, and it's really important to run these parallel, actually, because if we think about traditional workplaces and traditional classroom environments, it's probably quite similar,
yes.
right?
Yes.
and actually, just again, it's really that environment. I can tell it's just not right. It's not the right environment for my son. It's just really not, because all the things you're explaining are happening to him, and so therefore then, let's think about, okay, so let's take from that environment that your son is now in, and what are the conditions of that environment that are enabling your son and all those other boys to learn and get along and enjoy that environment?
Yeah, so it's things like where he and many of the others struggle with organisation, which again is a very common thing for neurodivergent people in the workplace. He would struggle to have the right books for the right lessons. He would struggle to keep his pencil case. He ended up carrying everything in his bag all of the time because of the fear of not having the right things. So you're having all the things. And again, that's what people do in the workplace. They've got all the tabs open because they're worried that they're going to miss one of the things and forget to come back to something. They've got all of the emails in the inbox because if you put them into folders, you might never find them again. So It's really directly comparable. And what they do at his school is in each classroom, each of the boys has a plastic box with all of the things they need for that lesson. So if you need a pen and a pencil, it's in the box. If you need the computers, they're in the room. Whatever documents you need, they're there. So it's ordered in a way that you don't have to access those executive function skills that you struggle with. And because of that, because you haven't had that challenge, it means you're then ready to learn or ready to work because you're taking away the things that cause the dysregulation, the things that cause the overwhelm.
Right. Oh, gosh, this is all making so much sense. Let's put that into the workplace then. Yeah. So someone who is neurodivergent in the workplace, let's use that similar example of the challenge being the email, the overwhelming administration. It gives me the, I have a thing about paper. I just can't with paper. So someone in the workplace, how can we translate that strategy? Because, realistically, they might not be able to have a box for every type of activity, but how might that translate?
So some of it can be things like thinking about the overwhelm of when you've got too much information, so you can't access the right information at the right time. Ensuring that we don't overload people with information that they don't need. So, for example, don't copy everyone in on emails if it's not necessary. And people get invited to meetings.
Oh, yes.
Because let's just invite everyone who might have anything to do with this topic. Firstly, it's quite hard for people to engage in meetings in those circumstances, but then you've got all of that information. You've got the minutes of the meeting, you've got the follow-ups, you've got all the email trail that comes after it. Really think about how many things do people need to be involved in, and try and only have the relevant information. And frankly, that doesn't just go for neurodivergent people. It's just good business sense. It's just about working more efficiently and more effectively. And the same with like Teams channels. How many chat channels do you need? And with distractions, you might, for example, say you don't expect people to be checking emails and checking chat more than once an hour, because something that you see a lot in corporates is it's this unwritten rule. It's the culture, but it's never official. But so many of my coaching clients will say, I have to respond to the emails. I have to respond to the Teams chat.
Urgently.
And I say, why do you have to respond? Well, it's just expected. And it is. We can't challenge that unless people actually actively say, this is not expected, because it's not an efficient way for anyone to work, and it just causes constant distractions and overwhelm. Yes. If we set an expectation that people will respond perhaps within half a day, it varies by organisation. It depends on what kind of communications they are as to what is a reasonable thing. But I think because we've got this constant stream of information, we create the culture ourselves almost, because 100%. It pings up. You get this FOMO, got to read it right now. and then someone responds, and then you can see I'm online, so I must respond, or you're going to think, oh, she's ignoring me, that's very rude. And we effectively create it ourselves. But someone needs to actively create a culture that's different, that says, no, we have these ways of communicating, but they're supposed to be there to help us, not to make our lives more difficult.
Yeah. For a neurotypical person, it's overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
But for someone who is neurodivergent, the sheer volume and complexity and variety of communication channels in itself can be incredibly overwhelming, distracting, and that feeling of being paralyzed in distraction, because there's so many messages, there's so many emails and notifications, that you freeze because you feel locked. And so therefore, again, it's chunking this up and thinking, well, we need a better communication strategy. We need to understand and organize how we're communicating to everybody, but also bearing in mind that somebody who is neurodivergent would also really, really benefit from this. So I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. It could be that one type of communication channel is for urgent communication. So that could be the instant message, the Slack, the Teams popping up. That type of communication could be only for a start, urgent. This needs to be done within the next hour and everything else needs to be dropped type of communication. Emails are, the urgent but not important, important but not urgent types of communication that could be responded to within half a day, or could be responded to after that. And then I guess any other type of, so the meetings. So I know, I've been out of corporate, like as in employed. I was employed 10 years ago in corporate, and I've been self-employed since, but I work in the organisations a lot, and I still see how it's a bane of people's existence that they're still invited to all these meetings, that the content of the meetings is still incredibly questionable, and also the follow-up to those meetings. Now, AI has completely revolutionized that. Even for me in my meetings now, you have a lovely AI generated synopsis at the end of a meeting, and so that can be sent out without even anybody having to take notes or do anything. And so therefore, being very strategic about who you're inviting to those meetings and why it's going to benefit them, because it could be really good for somebody to attend for their own growth, to stretch out of their comfort zone, to get visible to a stakeholder. That's a really good reason to go to a meeting. It could also be important for that person to go to the meeting because they are a key decision maker in the meeting, or they need to deliver information in that meeting. Anybody else? Do they need to attend? Strategically looking at these types of things, I think, is so important. But yeah, because everybody's so busy and they're flying by the seat of their pants, they don't have time to look at these things at a much higher level, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
So I really like this idea. This is sort of flipping this around for me. Again, I'm always thinking of my son, I'm thinking of myself, I'm thinking of the people I work with, but I'm also thinking of people in organisations, that if we can focus on the challenge, the thing that's locking, it feels like it's like, it can lock a problem, or it causes an obstacle to someone who then sort of increases the cognitive load, the executive function, as you said. We can look at sort of removing those to create an environment where those things are minimized as much as possible. That's when we can access strengths in a really good way. I love that.
Absolutely. And thinking back to where you say we can't have the plastic boxes in every room.
Yes.
The kind of equivalence that I chat with coaching clients about is very often the people miss action points when they're in chat threads, because chat threads become a chat about everything to do with a project. And so it becomes almost like a big conversation online. And that can be really hard for people to follow. And particularly if you get easily distracted, if you're trying to focus on the work and trying to focus on what you should be doing, you look at that and you don't necessarily take in that 3 pages down, your name was mentioned, that there was can you do this? So one way, the kind of online equivalent of that plastic box would be if I said, okay, I'm in all these project channels and that's great. I will read them from time to time. But if you have an action for me, can we just have a separate channel that's
Yeah.
Lisa's actions?
Yeah.
So if you want me to
Yes.
do something, please put it in something that very clearly tells me that you want an action from me, and tell me exactly what it is, why you want it, because context is really important.
Yes.
Why do you want it? What do you want? And when do you need it by? And put those things succinctly in a separate chat. And then I can go to that and think, yeah, I can work my way down that. I know exactly what people expect of me. Whereas if it's just lost in a thread, and then people say, why haven't you done that? You then have this guilt of, I can't even keep up with what people want me to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not about me not doing it. I didn't even know I was supposed to do it in the first
Yes.
place, because the way
Yes.
the communication has happened is not a way that works for my brain.
That's it. So separate threads, action threads, discussion threads. So organization of communication rather than one long thread, rather than one jumbled desk. We won't talk about my desk, but rather than one jumbled up desk, or a school environment where everything's everywhere and you've got to carry everything around with you. Separate channels of communication for separate things, and making things concise. I mean, that just makes so much sense, doesn't it? I've actually had to give that as feedback to some people in the last year or so, actually, because I was getting a lot of communication, a lot of lengthy communication, and then halfway down there would be an action, and I found that completely overwhelming. And so I said at the top of the email, can you list what the action is, so that then I can use the rest of the information as a reference, but I know exactly what, and they did, and then it was perfect after that. Oh, so it sounds like there's quite a lot of responsibility on the individual. Can we change that? Is there anything? Of course, we have to take responsibility, but sometimes, if you're overwhelmed, you're in the midst of drowning in communication, it's made you freeze. You might not have the clarity of mind to think, oh, actually, I need to communicate that this is what I need. Or you might find it difficult to speak up and say, actually, this doesn't work for me. It makes me feel overwhelmed and confused. And I would really prefer it if there was a separate thread where you could put actions. So I guess what's the answer there?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
For organisations, I would say that a starting point is recognising, exactly as you just said, Helen, that people might be overwhelmed and they might not know in the moment, but also that just because someone has received a diagnosis doesn't make them suddenly the expert in their condition. And I hear quite often of people saying they've been diagnosed, they've disclosed at work, and even where work are trying to be really supportive, they'll say, that's great, what do you need? And they have no idea, they've just been diagnosed. And with diagnosis, for many people, you go through, I explain it as the grief cycle. It's kind of the cycle of change, and you've got the denial and the anger, and you go through all of those things, and it takes a couple of years to really come to terms with a diagnosis of neurodivergence, particularly later in life. So almost the older you are when you're diagnosed, the longer it takes to unpack that and to recognise what support you need. And people are just being put on the spot of, okay, you got your diagnosis, now what?
Yes.
And really, they don't have a clue. So for organisations, I would say the key is to get training, to get a proper understanding, and not just for the line manager or for the HR team, but for everyone in the organisation to understand more about neurodivergence, about what it is, and about all the possible ways you might support people. And the key is that everyone is different. So I'm autistic and ADHD. But you can take me, you can take another autistic ADHD person. We will be completely different.
Yeah.
So we may or may not need the same adjustments. It depends on what works for each of us. But having some options there, having that knowledge, that understanding of here are some things that work for some people, and giving those as options of, would it be helpful if we set up a separate chat? Would it be helpful if we changed your seating location? Would it be helpful if you had noise cancelling headphones? All of those things. And then letting people try them, but recognizing that it doesn't stop there, that it evolves.
Yes.
And as people learn more about their own diagnosis and they try things, they will say, oh, actually, that works, that doesn't work. But again, I think sometimes you put in place an adjustment and then you just expect that that's
That's
and that
it.
the person isn't ever allowed to ask for anything else, because now they're sorted, that's fine, now they can just act like they're neurotypical. It's not like that. But another really, really important thing is recognizing that the way people are impacted by neurodivergence varies from day to day. So the things that impact me one day may not impact me the next day. And that can be dependent on how I'm feeling. So if I'm physically well, if I'm physically run down, that will make me more prone to overwhelm. But things like if I've been to, say, a networking event, I might have a really great time. It might be a really great event, but it's actually physically and mentally draining for me. And so because I recognize that, and because I run my own business, so I can do what I want to with my time, I now would block out, if it's been a full day event, I would block out the following day to make sure that I don't have any big client meetings. I would never do coaching calls on a day after I've had a big networking event, because I know that I won't be at my best, that I won't be able to give my best self to my clients. And so I can manage that. So it's that understanding of what I can do on a Monday might be very different from what I can do on a Friday, when I've had that build up across the week of the emails, of the meetings. So I deliberately plan my diary so that all of my high energy, my high brain powered things are at the start of the week.
Me too.
And I try to keep Thursday, Friday for networking, rest, catching up on admin, doing things that don't require so much processing power.
Yes.
And so having that recognition within organisations where employees don't have that same ability always to manage their own diaries, to manage the flow of events and meetings. But by discussing those things as a group, you can figure out what works best for most people.
So it really is, looking at this at the higher level, it is a fundamental part of the communication, the people and communication strategy, right? It is a fundamental item on the agenda. It's definitely not something that we're just going to bring in as part of the new way of the ticking the box. We actually need to look at this from a whole picture perspective in terms of how we are communicating and how we're working and how we can do that more efficiently, to lighten the cognitive load, really, to improve focus and increase productivity, to reduce distraction, and that's going to be beneficial for everybody. However, it's going to be particularly beneficial for neurodivergent people. Why is this so important to you? Why do you do this? I think we've kind of got a bit of an idea, but
yeah. So I originally trained as a chartered accountant. I started my career at Deloitte, so huge global organisation, and I found audit quite boring because it was the same thing time and time again. And so I moved into corporate finance. And I loved corporate finance because it was project-based. You never really knew what you were doing from one day to the next. There were deadlines. And I had no idea at the time of my neurodivergence. And when I look back at it, I recognise that corporate finance was awesome as an ADHD, because all of those things that kind of drive the dopamine. And then I went into industry, and I worked actually in HR as well. So I was head of people services for a couple of years, and I always had this huge interest in learning and development and how people think, how people communicate, just all the different ways you can learn how other people are thinking and feeling. But what I was also having in the background that people just did not see. So I've got 6 professional qualifications. I've held C-suite roles. I've worked in some of the largest organizations. So on the surface, I looked like I was being this highly successful professional. And actually, I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety 4 times. Even though I didn't feel depressed, it didn't feel quite right, that label. And I worked myself to nervous breakdowns. I ended up having a couple of months off at one point because I had just worked myself to absolute exhaustion, because I was always trying to do more to prove that I was good enough, because in my head, I was never good enough and I was never getting it quite right. I would never quite get that communication right, no matter how hard I worked, no matter how successful I was, no matter how many promotions and bonuses, I never quite got that relationship side of it right. And it was only after setting up my own business, after deciding to become a consultant, which coincidentally was at the same time as I was diagnosed, by fluke rather than by design, that I recognized why all of those things had happened. And that actually, if that had been known, if anyone had spotted it, if I'd had that kind of support in my professional career, I wouldn't have had to go through those breakdowns, that overwhelm, which I now recognise was neurodivergent burnout. I was in complete autistic burnout, ADHD, overwhelm. So I was trying so hard to fit into this neurotypical expectation. I was, coming back to our earlier conversation, I was almost trying to be that superhero. I was trying to make sure that at work, people only saw my superpowers, that I couldn't let anyone see these other bits, or they would know I was just this complete imposter. And with all that knowledge now, that led me to then train, I would say retrain, but I still do all the other things as well, which is quite common for neurodivergent folk to want to have all of the hats. So I still do all the business consulting as well, but I've also now trained as a coach specialising in neurodivergence, but I'm an International Coaching Federation trained coach, so I coach executive level. And I want to support people in a way that I needed that support and I didn't know I needed it at the time. So the support I wish I'd had, but didn't know I even needed at the time. And that's what drives me. I want to help people to flourish and not to have to go through all those things I went through, because it just was never considered that someone who is successful and intelligent and educated, you almost can't be neurodivergent. Those two things didn't go together, but they really do. There are so many people in the professions who are neurodivergent. Many of them probably don't recognise it yet, but there really are.
Yes. And so that is what Think Exceptionally is all about. And I love that. That's what, my next episode is called Legacy Phrases, and I think this is yours, right? Because so you're working with executive level leaders, and I'd imagine you're working with them to understand themselves, but also think about this from a strategic viewpoint as well. Does that enter into your work?
Yes, so I work as a coach, but I also work as neurodiversity consultant, and bringing my finance background into it as well. So we've spoken about all the people side of why it's a good thing to empower neurodivergence, but thinking about it from the purely financial side for businesses as well. When we don't support people in this way, what that leads to is increased sickness. It leads to lots of performance management, which takes an awful lot of HR time. And for a business, when you then ultimately lose those people because either they leave or you performance manage them out, that has a huge, huge cost to businesses, the costs of recruitment, the cost of the time of onboarding people, all of that HR time, doing those performance management. And if we flip that over and spent that money instead investing in training, in understanding, in supporting people so that they can bring those strengths to the workplace, we would have so much more positive outcome from that, both from a people perspective, a wellbeing perspective, and a financial perspective for the organisations.
Yes, I just see it as, you know, such a fundamental part of the strategy. You know, obviously I'm thinking from when I was employed and I was heading up people strategy in a division. Yeah. And the segments of that people strategy and what that looked like. And, you know, this is just such a fundamental part of that from the top down in terms of how we operate in a much more efficient way. It comes down to being, you know, efficient, streamlined, simplified, clearer in how we're communicating, not so slapdash, haphazard, complex. And by doing this, we can meet needs and address these types of challenges in a way that isn't singling one person out who's had a diagnosis, is looking at a whole picture perspective. I sometimes think I don't think I could ever be employed again. I just don't think I could. But if I was, I would love to be in that type of team. You know, I would love to be doing that type of thing, you know, making that type of difference. And I know that people listening to this might be going, yeah, we've got this as part of our strategy. Well, great. I guess I'm not hearing enough of that as to why we're talking about this. And also, it's great to know that you are doing that you are going into organizations, that you are having those conversations from your personal perspective with such a powerful personal story behind it, and that you are helping those leaders to understand themselves better, to feel okay about the challenges they faced all of their life, the burnout that they faced, and not understanding why that they burnt themselves out, or that they felt that they never quite fit in, or that they couldn't quite get it right, you know, that it's always a struggle. It wasn't ever really smooth sailing despite the success. Just even having that acceptance and understanding of someone, you know, one-to-one or group is huge. So I'm really grateful that now I know about you and the work that you're doing, and in the conversations that I'm having within organisations, I will be bringing that more to the forefront of my mind, and also for my son. You know, really personally, it just makes me even more determined to meet his needs, so that he can access his strengths. And
thank you. I'm really happy to have shared with you, and thank you. That's really kind of you to say all those things.
So I do always end with asking the same question to my guests, and that is, what words have changed your life?
So the words that really resonated a lot for me is a quote from Harvey Bloom, who is a neurodiversity advocate, and he says, "Neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will be best at any given moment?" And I love that, because it's giving permission to think exceptionally, rather than continually trying to learn how to be neurotypical. We need everyone. We need that diversity.
We do. Oh my God, I'm feeling emotional. I've never heard that quote before. Neurodiversity is as important as biodiversity. Wow. That's going to take some time for me to really pick that apart, but that is such a good quote to leave on. Thank you for sharing that with me, Lisa. Everything that you want to know about Lisa will be in the show notes of this episode. Please do get in touch with her if you felt inspired by this conversation. Thank you so much, Lisa, for coming on Words That Change Lives.
Thank you for having me.
I'll see you all next time.